Hello, and welcome to my comments on your session that revolve around critical issues in command and leadership, and with linkages to the movie that you watched, The Dirty War, about the sort of a ominous projection into July 5th events in London. So John was facilitated and moderating this one, and so thank you for a really good discussion. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed all your hangouts in the summer, and your group is small, so you get to have a really good, interesting insights, and you're comfortable with one another. So explanation of heedfulness, Crystal unpacked it really nicely and talked about relationships, interdependencies, and being mindful of those, and being not only mindful of those, but being able to leverage them in an event that is complex. And then you had some discussion on intractability and how the ability to be the heedfulness or tunnel vision tends to emerge where the events are intractable or sort of get out of hand. And I think you had a discussion going back and forth on when different agencies with different issues are coming to the table in those events, they tend to focus on their own stuff, and you sort of have a bigger tendency to have a tunnel vision. And with respect to heedfulness, I think I want to bring your attention to the framework, the Cunefin framework that you had in one of your videos, and particularly the difference between complicated and complex. The heedfulness, very much of the heedfulness is about knowing where you are. And as long as people who are in charge realize what kind of situation they are they in a complicated or are they in a complex situation? Then a lot of that heedfulness the situational awareness, really, the reading the environment and knowing where you are will determine a successful outcome or not successful, and whether that event will become intractable. Because clearly, from all the studies in incident command, most of the events that become intractable, they become intractable because of the actions taken or not taken within the very first acute phase of the incident. And certainly that is linked to planning, and it's linked to mitigation, and it's linked to previous ability of the system to recover. So it's sort of backward linked as well. But in a response scenario, in those first minutes or hours, in that acute phase of the response, certain actions, if not completed, will cause the event to be intractable. And then, of course, John mentioned that some events just become being intractable. So, when you get 60 inches of rain and it's, just really hard to get a hold of this from the very get-go, so the initial actions won't determine the outcome anyway, because the event is so overwhelming, and those events happen as well. So being able to determine if you are in a complex environment or complicated environment is really, really important. In a complicated environment, your standard operating procedures should work, because complicated environment has the variables there. You just need to unpack them and link them. A complex environment has all those unpredictable variables, right? All those uncertainties. So complex environment was Deepwater Horizon spill. That was a complex environment. And so if an incident commander realizes that they're in complex, not in complicated, their decision making should be different. Their collaboration, ability to ask for help or look from a different perspective or be innovative or show certain levels of adaptation or breaking the rules. I think you talked about it in this section as well. That is a different modus operandi than it is in a complicated scenario. So heedfulness, I think, is this ability to mind. It's mindfulness. I think that's the new term now in the United States. We talk a lot about mindfulness. So being aware. The young students now call it being woke. I just heard that on a study abroad that I ran in the first part of the summer. The most favorite new word is woke. So is the incident commander woke to what's going on? Are they on top of things? He or she. And so Dalia was talking about, you did talk about interoperability decreases when that heedfulness is not high, or when the event becomes more intractable. And certainly mindfulness or heedfulness in high-risk situations is going to determine how well that risk is mitigated. Interoperability increases when you have people that are aware that they have to communicate beyond their own system, right? That they have to share information. And then, you had a really good discussion on competency. Part of a heedfulness or that mindfulness is composure. I think that's a very, very critical piece of leadership in command. Crystal, I think it was Crystal, mentioned the two in a Tales from the Hot Seat, mentioned two incident commanders. One was, Chicken Little, everything falls out of the sky and, flaps the wings and, everybody's, terrified and barks orders. I think that's Dalia's term. And the other one is composed, quiet, reflectful, thoughtful. And I think we have, perhaps media has also created that strong image of the incident commander that is that in charge means, to be very aggressive, very dynamic, very everywhere, all over the place. But as you said, composure is really critical, and calm is contagious, as you mentioned. I really like that. It so happens that I'm not sure if it's in that chapter, but certainly it's, I have talked with and met with people who knew the incident commander, the calm composure incident commander in the book. It was Thomas Mars from Oklahoma City bombing. He was the incident commander for the Oklahoma City bombing. So certainly somebody that has documented very well that they were extremely competent with such a very complicated event as Oklahoma City bombing was, and what a great response it is. And it was, because it set the golden standard for not only in the 90s for ICS, it was really FEMA coming out really victorious from its first couple decades of functioning. After the first very, very difficult years and very bad leadership, it was Oklahoma City bombing response that gave FEMA, but FEMA got that because of the local response, right? Because how well they worked together. But it was because of the leadership at the scene, and Mars was one of those people. So in addition to the mindfulness and being able to build relationships and being able to see interdependencies. It's also, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to have, there is nothing wrong with being softer in those, first response organizations. You don't have to be that paramilitary style that people don't respond very well to that, particularly because when you think about it today, in most of organizations, even policing, or I say even because it tends to be more paramilitary than others, you don't have people barking orders anymore. It is not very acceptable. So there is no reason for that, during crisis. I thought that was really interesting. Certainly, composure and calm. It's a very big attribute of having a ability to have a clear mind, to apply recognition prime decision making, because it allows you that pause for retrieval from the deep memory, right? So the reflection, although it's not going to be so analytical decision making, in crisis, is still people that can remain calm. It's a very important attribute. I think Andrea went down the list of all those different qualities of or requirements of dynamic systems on the incident command, and some of them were prioritizing different activities when the events are cascading. And so you talked about decontamination units and how they were moved and changed. The priorities were changing because the wind was changing and they were moving them around, and many, many issues surrounding the situation. In Dirty War, you looked at secondary devices, the issues of secondary devices. You looked at investigations or ongoing investigations for who else was part of the plot, or to get more intelligence. And of course, managing your politicians, because in all the midst of that, you suddenly have Sheila Jackson Lee walking in, right? So you have those different factors that are happening, and you got able to be going between them, and certainly politicians and operational field level command and investigations versus healthcare officials and EMS. All those have different priorities. So when you talk about that heedfulness here in that scenario, the person that can bridge between the politics and understanding that Sheila Jackson Lee has a role, right, and that you need to expect that the elected officials are gonna want to know for their constituencies, that doctors have a different mission, that firefighters have a different mission, that military or civil security forces will have a different mission. So that was a very good example, I think, you laid out of competing interests of different organizations and navigating throughout those. I think you had quite a bit of discussion on that medical aspect of, retrieving the injured and the wounded versus, we can't risk, being in this zone, and, this is collateral damage at this point. Exercise and test capabilities and be able to use predefined courses of action. There was another section that you discussed, and I think the video shows it very well as well, that you had all those pre-designated sites. I think John mentioned that there were different pre-designated areas for where, in some mutual aid agreements probably in place where those would be standing up, because, well, certainly in the United States, it would be like that. If you have a medical sector, healthcare sector is mostly private, so it's not national health sector. It's 90% of operators are in private hands, so you would have to have mutual aid agreements of some sort. And then you have an issue here in the United States, which hospitals actually have the contamination corridors and what the protocols are versus which businesses have the contamination capabilities. That might not be medical businesses. So, which is certainly in a chemical industry business, the contamination capability in the area is very high. In Houston area, we would have a very high decontamination capability, but do we have that pre-planning? So the good incident commander would know at least that such plans might exist, where to access them, or who would know where they are, or who would be the major players that would know, who would know where to look for those. And certainly having a domain knowledge and knowing standard operating procedures is really critical. Now, as you had discussions about creative decision-making and recognition prime decision-making, and also what I call unstrapping. And this is, Andrea mentioned an article that by me and Dr. Baker about Harvey and decriminalization. We call it desecuritization during critical incident. And all the research confirms that. In Oklahoma City, after the Oklahoma City bombing, crime rates dropped. And certainly people relax with issues of security when they have a citizen response versus in normal blue sky day where they wouldn't give a ride to somebody to to a shelter that they just saw on the street. So in addition to this research, we have done analysis of what's called unstrapping, and unstrapping is basically we discerned three categories of unstrapping. The back channel communications, circumvention, and violation. And back channel communications happen mostly at the mid to higher level executive leadership of those events. Circumvention happens mostly in the field or in voluntary credential volunteer organizations and so on and so forth. Violation happens among spontaneous volunteers, victims, although those categories can overlap. And when I say unstrapping, I say basically breaking down the rules and circumventing or totally back channeling the system. So I have digressed here, but so when you're talking again about the ability, the incident commander needs to know how to exercise an SOP, know that there is an SOP and what it is, what the policy is, what the accountability is, but they also, he or she has to be able to unstrap, has to be able to break it. And you had a good discussion in this session about that. You talked about police officers that took victims to hospitals in their cars. I believe in some of the instances you talked about that being against the state law in a particular event, and it might have been in Massachusetts during the Boston Marathon bombing. But the same case happened, John, I think, reiterated that it happened in Las Vegas shooting, and it happened in Orlando. So where actual first responders were taking victims to render medical aid in their own vehicles. And so that's an example for me, an example of unstrapping. and that would be unstrapping by violation, because you violate an existing policy, an existing law. And there is a risk to this, because for people in higher levels of command, they run a risk of losing a job, not being reelected, being ostracized in a professional community, not having the esprit de corps, or collegiality, so to speak, or others looking at them differently after the event, because they broke the norm. So there is risk to those decisions. So I would venture to say that with ability to exercise the courses of actions, look at capabilities, comes also the ability to assume the risk for one's decisions and be brave to take that risk, because the worst incident commander you might ever have is the one that is paralyzed, or that cannot make that decision because they're afraid of liability. And you will always gonna run a risk of being sued anyway. So I thought that you unpacked that really nice. Pre-written plans, pre-deployment, I've mentioned that, you discussed that. Conflicting roles and new courses of actions for new crises and novel threats. So certainly you cannot, every scenario, and even those worst case scenarios that we built in a training environment, the simulations, you discuss tactical decision games, and you discuss the role of simulations, and simulations are great. I ran the simulation unit at the Law Enforcement Institute for years, so it's called Incident Command Simulation Training Program in COSIT. And the simulation programs are far superior to tabletop exercises, or even full-scale exercises, even functional exercises. And the reason is because a lot of simulations can be captured, video and audio, and it could be archived, and it could be analyzed, and you can actually really track the decisions very well. Typically in tabletops or functional and full scale, even when you have evaluators, it's usually not a very integrated effort. It's very touch and go. And usually it's not as analytical as the simulation is. So the simulations are really, really, really good. But no matter what you do in your simulation, you cannot ever predict what's going to happen, right? The variables are going to change, and even one variable is going to have a totally different, it could affect the entire planning process. So the whole planning can collapse because of just one factor. And think about this in a sense of, and anything I put it on one of your papers, that the Houston Police Department is considered the transportation, in charge of transportation for the City of Houston Emergency Operation Plan Annex. Well, that is all good when the transportation is traditional, which means it's happening on the ground. However, you take out the infrastructure of ground transport, and then that entire unit is totally, the entire annex doesn't have a capability for, water operations. So just one variable, affects the entire way you plan. So again, for incident command, or good incident command, is, again, we go to heedfulness, realizing that you can never, ever create a reasonable answer to unpredictability. You cannot manage unpredictability. You cannot manage chaos. Those events, catastrophic events, disasters, are not manageable by the virtue of the fact that they are unpredictable. So if you think you can manage them, if you have that invulnerability of conviction that you can manage, then that's not heedfulness. You lack mindfulness that there are limitations. There are always going to be limitations in resources, in processes, in planning procedures, and that's why that really, really critical piece of resilience is adaptation, improvisation, innovation, unstrapping, being able to come and break or circumvent or circumnavigate or even violate something in order to develop a new course of action, as John mentioned. Some of the repercussions, I think Andrea mentioned about, how risky those decisions are and how they made a decision of getting people off the trains, and the Liverpool station was the one where the bomb could have blown up. And so the scenario would have been, it was a very risky decision to make. And certainly in retrospect or in hindsight, we can say, well, it could have ended up differently. But those people have to prioritize and have to make those decisions on the spot. And risk is going to be involved. Now, I think you mentioned something about aircraft and safety for the aviation traffic with radiation. And typically in emergency management or crisis management here in Incident Command in the United States, generally it's the job of the somebody in the Incident Command system. Generally would be liaison officer or perhaps the public information officer is to request through the command is to request the temporary flight restrictions from the FAA. So that's one of those critical first pieces of an acute phase of managing the incident, right? So if you have temporary flight restrictions and air traffic is reserved to essential personnel or rescue personnel, like, Coast Guard and stuff like that, but then you don't have that added liability of either media getting, the wrong footage or being in a harm's way, or anybody being in a harm's way, as you had the situation with contamination, radiation in London and dirty war. Now, I want you to think about something. The decisions, of course, about life safety, and you talked about the decision to take off his SCBA and fight the fires by the fire watch commander. And this is really a very important part of leadership in incidents, is the life safety and life saving issue. We talked in ICS, there is a difference between the two. Life saving, obviously, is those people that are trapped in those burning vehicles that he was going to rescue. But then there's also life safety and the safety of first responders. And, we ultimately drawn to 9/11, and you even mentioned 9/11 in this Hangout when you discussed how different competing organizational priorities prevented fire from listening to the police who had better situational assessment. And they said, today no cop in New York is going to tell us what to do. It's, not a direct quote, but it's something in that vein. So when I go back to the scene where Marley decides to go and extinguish the fires at the expense of his own health and his life, you are thinking about those incident commanders that are going to have to make decisions about their personnel and how they deal with this, and whether they condone it or whether they don't condone it. Because life safety of a first responder is really critical. That person could be critical to other operation later on, where you might not be able, at a short glance, to save anybody from those burning vehicles at that point. And yet, he is making his independent decision. Marley definitely violated and unstrapped, right? He made a decision against the safety standards for him. But then, he is a first responder, but then there is a leadership on top of him. And, those are very difficult decisions that people are going to make, the field operators on the ground. So the incident commander has to have that heedfulness or mindfulness about how they're going to deal with this. How is it going to be approached in after action reporting, and is it going to be part of how those discretionary actions are going to be conducted? And those are very difficult decisions to make. I don't know what you think about it. You certainly can go back to the shooting in Florida and think about the officer that did not go into the active shooter scene and what happened with that. And there was a different decision, right? So you have two very different decision-making processes. But for the leadership, for command of that event, are they aware that those decision-making processes can be happening at the field level? Or are they so withdrawn that they don't even know what's happening? I think that being aware of those issues coming up is really critical, because then you have another layer of, how you deal with families, how you deal with other personnel and other troops that you are in charge of. So I think I think everybody really loved that scene when the van was immobilized. I think there is a general consensus in your group that you didn't know exactly how they did that, but they were able to do it right in time. Had some interesting perspectives on that. And then your discussion went into Habibullah, and you looked at the perspectives on the decision to interrogate, or you talked about controlling the impulses and controlling your emotions in command, but you also talked about the priority of getting the information. And the scene with Habibullah, when they are telling her that she better leave, and you had this interesting exchange on whether they told her that because she was a female or because they told her that because she was a Muslim. And that is really fascinating. I never really thought about her. I never thought that it was such a deep thought process, that particular scene. I, however, think about Habibullah in different terms. Particularly, when I think about incident command and leadership, is and I don't think that is listed in your list of things of the critical issues to consider in incident command, but it's that cultural awareness and sensitivity to diversity, because this was very critical in this event. And I think you mentioned the lady that had the information about the guys, not going to the mosque, although they were so religious, and pulling off some containers in the middle of the night. She would not have opened up to anybody else. And it took a lot of nuance and a lot of cultural understanding to be able to reach out to that particular person to get this information. And when we talk about intelligence, and when we talk about local level intelligence, and if you took the intelligence course, if you see something, say something. Those are really great initiatives that are generally, very hard to define, right? But it really, here you see that if you see something, say something, is kind of shallow until you have the right approach to it. Because somebody can share something when they are trusting, when they're comfortable, and when you actually, and then that's, that's another part of analysis, that ability to analyze the situation, the ability to understand it, being situationally aware. So Habibullah was perfect for that. And that was a great choice that she was brought in. So the ability to pick people that are going to work across those different environments, that are going to be culturally aware, is really important. The incident commander or the leaders can't do all those things. They don't speak a million languages. They don't operate in different socioeconomic strata. They only know their piece. But it's being able to nominate or appoint the right people that can tease it out. It's really important. And I think Habibullah is a perfect example of that. And I think Dalia also had a really interesting conversation here on strategy, tactics, and operations. You called that the STO. So the levels with which the dissemination of knowledge happens. The strategic level, experiences are different at a strategic level. There is a lot more administration and policy experience. Tactical, of course, that's the, very, very strong knowledge, being on the tip of the spear. So knowing things as they operate on the ground. So that's very, very ground level. Strategic is this 30,000 feet above the ground, and operational is the ability to oversee that, tactics to fulfill the missions. And I think that's a really, really nice breakdown. But when you think about it, our law enforcement and different agencies that come to deal with the disasters and crises are not so clear cut. In England, so when you're looking at the dirty war, in England, there are 3 levels of command. It's really simple. There's gold, there's silver, and it's bronze. And if you read in Flynn and Arbuthnot, you will have a discussion on that, on the gold, silver, and bronze. Here, what do we have? We have an instant command system, which is helping the fact that we don't have the gold, silver, and bronze, because we don't have a standardized, services like National Fire Service or National Police Force, or, very, very centralized. So it's hard to pick those levels. Even when you think about ranks in police departments, one rank of lieutenant from that department is not even or equivalent to the competencies that a lieutenant has in a different police department. So it's very difficult to create those layers. So we have ICS. It's a lot more challenging because it is not used every day in everyday operations. So whereas the gold and silver and bronze in England reflects the everyday functioning of those institutions. So we do have, system-wise, we do have a lot more challenge on that. So, kind of establishing what's strategic, who needs to know what at a strategic level and make those decisions, who is at operational level, who is at tactical level. So who should be in charge of what and what level is sometimes very difficult. And there is, I think, John maybe alluded to the Santa Fe shooting, and that was a big event you had on your hands, and you said that there was a lot of people doing things that they were really not in their purview, so to speak. That's the ideally ICS works, and ideally ICS did not work in Harvey, for example. But the issue of it is it's because it is not the reflection of normal structures every day, right? And those distinctions between strategic and operational and tactical. I think you mentioned media, John. You mentioned that everybody wanted to be a PIO and everybody wanted to have that 15 minutes of camera exposure, and everybody wanted to have part in this event, even though maybe that wasn't their venue. And then you had a very good discussion on Boston Marathon bombing and how the governor mayor was actually in support role and that would be the precept of the ICS. It's not what you do every day, but in England it would be, right? If you are gold in England, you're going to be gold in crisis or gold in the blue sky. If you are silver, you're silver. Your rank reflects that, and your training and all the competencies and all the testing and everything that you do in exercises, you do to your role, and you do to what you do every day. Whereas not necessarily here, we train for cross train for to be able to assume any of those positions. Ideally, people that are the most qualified. Ideally, the two overlap, right? Somebody who is a gold, so somebody who makes very, very strategic decisions would be, at that coordination and support level, and not in the field, right? Putting out fires. But this is a really important issue that goes to resilience. Who is assigned, where are they doing, what is in their competency and in the skill level. And while I'm talking about that, before I move to swarm intelligence, I just wanted to reiterate or reverberate on something that John mentioned about experience, domain knowledge, and competence, and heedfulness, and mindfulness, and experience as an indicator of competence. And I think that we can all agree that experience is necessary. However you build it, whether it is through leading those events and being part of them, and they don't happen very often, so there'll be very, very few people that are qualified, or through immersive environments and certificates and trainings, and taking every opportunity you can to hone your skills and get more education and get more involvement and get more in those different working groups and getting to know people. And John, you mentioned all that. Short of those crises happening every day, you've got to build that experience somehow, and those things help. But experience that is meaningful is not always just the experience. So you might have somebody young and very driven and with very, very short experience, and I think you make that point, who can absolutely outperform a dinosaur with 20 or 30 years of experience that is not relevant or meaningful, or doing things without reflection or analysis, or always doing the wrong things, right? Or having very little retrospection on their own practice. So I would say, and I see it very often, that it's very automatic, especially when young students like you graduate and so on, and you're trying to get into the field, and you've never carried a gun, and you've never put anybody on a stretcher, and you've never ever saved anybody out of a collapsing building. But you have learned a lot of things. You've learned GIS, or you learned this, or you learned management, or you attended those type of trainings, or you developed this. Whereas somebody might have been working for an agency for 10 or 15 years, and they are usually people that have the biggest objections, right? And they haven't really done much in crisis management, so their experience is not the equivalent of having good acumen of skills to make them a good leader in those situations, good incident commander. So I felt that was very important, because particularly as the emergency management workforce is graying, and you're going to see massive retirements, there's going to be less and less people with really, really long experience spanning decades. You're going to have more and more people with relatively less experience and wanting to promote faster, like yourselves. And I think that education is really critical as well. and it would help for mindful, heedful leaders in emergency management realize that and can leverage it. Swarm intelligence, Dalia talked about the two strands on that, the emergence and the leveraging of technologies. And you went back to the studies of emergence. Emergence is, pretty much inextricable from emergency management. In any disaster and any critical event, you will have emergence, whether it be spontaneous volunteers or it would be, those phenomena like unstrapping and, circumventing back channel. This is all emergence or novel solutions to novel crises. And then the adoption and adaptation. And so you had a discussion on here you had a discussion on the protocols, and breaking protocols and being able to swarm around the issue or emerge in new behavior that is breaking with traditional norms or standard operating procedures. Certainly, you talk about whether, or discussion was supposed to be whether the swarm intelligence and command and control structures were mutually exclusive. And it was interesting because John mentioned it depends how much control is in control. I thought that was very interesting. And yes, how do we, and I think it goes back to heedfulness, right? The realization, what I mentioned earlier, that those events are unpredictable. So you cannot have typical command and control structures and processes, incident command system, standard operating procedures, and hope that you're going to be working only within those parameters, because every situation is going to throw a challenge at you and you're not going to have capabilities or capacities to solve a new problem with old tools. And you're going to have to think about something beyond that toolbox. And that's where the emergence comes in. So to a certain extent, I think the emergence in a system causes the system to break the norms and standard operating procedures, because the emergence is a symptom that the plan is not working. If you have people rescuing people in boats, that is a symptom that the response did not happen based on a traffic plan or, based on how it was predicted. So I think both go hand in hand. If there is an understanding from the incident command that you cannot pre-plan. The plans are, it's maybe not about the plans. Maybe plans are an illusion. Maybe it's about the planning process. Maybe plans can always be thrown through the window. It is what happens in the planning process, where you get to develop perspectives and different views, and what you actually put on a shelf and what you amass and all those indexes and annexes and stuff. Maybe that's not that relevant, but you have to go through that process to create capabilities, and those capabilities are soft capabilities of connectivity with people. Crystal's talking about crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing was huge in Harvey. And that's something Matthew Marchetti, I don't know if you've heard about Matthew, but Matthew Marchetti opened a crowdsourced rescue during Harvey. Matthew was basically on his bike asking whether he can help, because he had an EMT license. And he's this young kid that buys houses, has a partner, and then they have a small startup company, and he's an IT guy. And so he's asking in Memorial Villages whether help is needed, and they said, no, you can go 3 miles down the road to the fire station, report there, that's where the volunteers go. But he's on a bike, and some of the areas are in 10 feet of water, and he goes, screw that, I'm not going to do this. So he circumvents, doesn't report to where he's supposed to report to. Instead, he comes up with this, people helping people app because, he thinks that the resources there on the ground are totally inadequate. They're trying to get these people evacuated from the neighborhood, but because of the bands of water coming through and say it's too risky and too dangerous, and first responders are not going to do that. They don't have the capability. So he comes up with that idea and puts this website in a matter of hours on, Sunday after the storm. And he's afraid. I mean, he is freaked out that on Monday he's going to read in the newspapers, a crazy maniac, has a risky operation on people helping people website. How crazy is that? He wakes up and there's several hundreds of records of people matching with people for rescues. And by the end of the 3-day operation, he's got 7,700 records, which is about 25,000 people rescued by volunteers. And he's out, and the thing is moving over to Beaumont. In the meantime, the sex trafficking hotline surrenders their operations. They seize their operations on sex trafficking hotline, and they take over the calls that are to crowdsourced rescue, and they start now doing the wellness checks for people that are being evacuated, using the scripts and templates and stuff like that. Not only that, the Coast Guard, the Cajun Navy, get a hold of the Zello, and they start, Zello is becoming that walkie-talkie app is becoming now the application connecting those rescuees and rescuers beyond the website platform. So it serves as a dispatch. That's all new. That's all emergent. That all came out of nowhere in Harvey by one person who just decided to say, well, you know what, I'm just not going to do that traditional stuff, go to the police station or fire station because my EMT license expired anyway, even though it just lapsed. They're going to probably ask for it. So I might as well do it differently. So what are the implications of that? Good incident commanders, city mayors, judges, commissioners, politicians have to know that this is how people typically behave in disasters. This is what people typically will do. This is not an aberrant behavior. And again, that the swarming is, it's happening, right? So control. Knowing when to relax control, knowing when to make the system flexible is an element of system resiliency, right? If you push a standard operating procedure, if you push that process, the system will break. Let's see. The enemies, you mentioned the enemies of swarm intelligence. And again, I think, John, you had a really good point on the unstrapping when you talked about your situation when you were a patrol sergeant, or your assistant chief at the time was a patrol sergeant. I think that's what it was. And you were setting up a parade, and your situation with a dump truck and discretion in decision making. And also, you talked about the Royal Navy commander that was going to the Falklands. I think that's from your readings on incident commanders and how he had a tremendous situational awareness and, how he get to know his ship and stuff like that, and the realization that sometimes you have to break the orders. And then again, that goes with the risk and with the ethics issue. What defeats swarm intelligence? Lack of familiarity among leaders. You talked about that in the movie Dirty War. There were people that didn't know their agency's priorities, or they have never met, or they had totally different image of how things were done, right? Were you at the same thing I was at? Because, what you're talking about is just totally different than my experience. Media, I think that here you talked about a little bit about elected officials having to deal with reassuring the public, but making sure that there are right people in right places, and that in the realization that they have a role. I mentioned, that's why I mentioned Sheila Jackson Lee, or just because she's from Houston and because she is notorious for going into the crisis scene and wanting to tour and stuff like that. So they're always, I didn't pick her out for no reason. It's just, and she's known for that. So you got to have those officials that are more engaged than others, and that's you got to manage that. This is a very important piece of management. Historical rivalries, I think, again, you talked about the fire department of New York and New York Police Department. I don't think that's necessarily about historical rivalries around them, but certainly distinct operations, were working within their own jurisdictions, within their own guidelines, within their own operating systems. It's you want to talk historical rivalry, that would be FBI and CIA, but that's again a topic for intelligence class. And so failure to join into the mission or see a shared mission and competing priorities, and transparency issues. And I think that from that, I'm not sure who brought it up, but I think this last point that you've made about unique challenge of today is managing expectations. And I think that goes with, the expectation of certainty by people, and, the expectation that the plans have to be reliable and have to be bulletproof. And so the emergency management is continually facing that challenge. But, I think that public education, public outreach, and communicating the constraints, communicating the how complex that environment is, it's very important during the blue sky days. So I hope you enjoyed the readings. I can see that you do the readings from the Tales of a Hot Sea, the book. I think it's a really good book, even though it's from the British side, but it's got some really good insights. So thank you, John, for facilitating that, and I'll see you on the next one.